I found out my daughter-in-law was using my money to pay for hotel rooms with her lover. She said my voice was annoying and kicked me away from the dinner table in the house I legally own. And my son, her husband, just looked down and said nothing. But what she didn't know was that I had just opened a locked box hidden in the wall, and hell was about to break loose. If you think this is just another family drama, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next. The clink of silverware against porcelain was the only sound in the kitchen as Margaret Hale sliced into the roast chicken she had spent the better part of the afternoon preparing. Her hands, once strong and swift, now moved with careful precision, a lifetime of muscle memory compensating for the slow ache in her wrists. The smell of rosemary, garlic, and lemon filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of wood polish she'd used earlier that day to buff the old oak table. The dining room gleamed softly under the dim light of the chandelier. The long table carved decades ago by her father-in-law was set for three, one spot for Andrew, her only son, one for Vanessa, his wife, and one for herself, though lately it felt more like a place marker than a seat of belonging. Margaret adjusted the linen napkins one final time and glanced at the wall clock. 6:45. Andrew would be home any minute. He was never late, not since he was a boy. Moments later, the front door creaked open. She heard footsteps, muffled conversation, and Vanessa's distinct voice rising in laughter that didn't reach the eyes. Margaret smiled tightly and called out, "Dinner's ready." They entered the room with the ease of people who did not think to greet the one who had spent hours preparing their meal. Vanessa wore a silk blouse too sheer for December, paired with black slacks that swished as she walked. Her heels clicked on the hardwood floor like a metronome counting down something unseen. Andrew followed closely behind, face already tucked into his phone, fingers dancing across the screen. Margaret pulled out a chair. "I hope you're hungry," she said with quiet warmth. "I made the lemon rosemary chicken you used to love, Andrew, and that rice pilaf with the toasted almonds." Andrew slid into his seat with a nod. "Smells good, Mom." Vanessa sat down opposite Margaret, crossing her legs and fixing her eyes on the flickering candle between them, as though it were more interesting than the company. Her lips twitched into a polite smile that didn't quite reach the corners. "I've gone gluten-free," she said blandly, "but I'm sure it'll be fine." Margaret's heart sank, though she didn't let it show. She had read up on Vanessa's new health kicks, she always had one, but the rice pilaf was gluten-free and the chicken classic, safe. She wasn't trying to impress, only to nourish, to be useful, to matter. Dinner began in brittle silence. Andrew asked about a logistics merger at work, and Vanessa launched into a description of an upcoming investor dinner she was planning, her voice sharp and fast, filled with buzzwords and self-congratulation. Margaret listened, nodding gently sometimes, inserting a comment, sometimes asking a soft question. But every time she did, Vanessa's eyes tightened just a fraction more. "I just think it's a bit reckless to count on that kind of investment in this market," Margaret offered. When Vanessa mentioned an ambitious new expansion plan, Vanessa's fork paused midair. "Do you even know how modern equity works, Margaret?" Andrew's phone buzzed. He glanced down at it. Margaret looked at her son, hoping for a glance, a smirk, something to ease the tension that was thickening like smoke between them. "Nothing." She cleared her throat and tried again. "When your father was alive, he always said—" Vanessa cut in with a laugh that had no softness in it. "Here we go. Harold Hale, the man who built the world with his bare hands. We know." Margaret flinched. Andrew didn't react, just chewed. "I'm just saying," Margaret murmured. "He had a saying about debt and timing." Vanessa set her knife down with a loud clack. "Your voice gives me a headache." The words landed like glass breaking. Margaret blinked. "Excuse me." Vanessa leaned back in her chair, eyes glinting with that signature smirk that always came before she fired the final bullet. "Could you just eat somewhere else, please? It's hard enough talking business over dinner without." She twirled her finger lazily in the air, the constant commentary. Andrew shifted, glanced briefly at his mother, then down at his plate. His jaw worked. He didn't say a word. Margaret stared at him. 1 heartbeat. 2. He never looked up. Something cold moved through her chest. She rose slowly, her chair scraping against the polished wood floor like a reluctant goodbye. "Of course," she said, voice steady though her throat burned. "I'll eat upstairs." She reached for her plate. Her hands trembled not from age this time, but something far deeper. She picked up her silverware with trembling fingers and moved toward the staircase like a shadow fleeing a room already dark. Behind her, Vanessa began talking again. Something about Q1 projections. Something about rebranding. Margaret walked up the stairs in silence. Each step felt like an indictment, a closing argument, a resignation letter written in invisible ink across the banister. She paused on the landing and glanced at the hallway where Andrew had once sprinted in footed pajamas, waving crayon drawings and calling her name. No one called her name anymore. In the solitude of her room, Margaret set the plate on the desk. She pulled the chair out slowly, as if afraid it might collapse under her. She sat, her knees creaking, her eyes glassy. The chicken had gone cold. The pilaf was congealed. She lifted her fork and tried to eat, but each bite was a stone dry and heavy in her mouth. The flavors she'd once crafted with love now tasted of dust and distance. Salt came not from the seasoning, but from her tears, silent at first, then fuller faster until her shoulders shook. It wasn't just the cruelty of Vanessa's words. It was the compliance of Andrew's silence that more than anything cracked something inside her. Margaret looked around the room, her room lined with memories she hadn't touched in years. Harold's old reading chair still sat by the window. A half-sewn quilt lay folded at the foot of her bed. Photos lined the dresser, some with Andrew's childhood grin, others of her and Harold dancing on a beach, young and golden and alive. And here she was, 72, eating alone like an intruder in the house she had once ruled with gentleness. The clock ticked. Downstairs she could hear laughter again. That sound didn't belong to her anymore. She set down her fork, wiped her cheeks, and stood. Something in her spine straightened as she walked to the mirror. The face looking back wasn't frail. It was forgotten, dismissed, misjudged. That night Margaret didn't cry herself to sleep. She didn't fall into the usual pit of self-blame and rationalization. She sat at her desk with the lamp on and began sorting through old files. Harold's notes, financial papers, documents she'd long neglected because Harold had always handled them. But she had time now, and a reason. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for yet, but she could feel it. A current under her skin. Not rage, not sadness, something sharper. Clarity, resolve. She was tired of being invisible. And the woman who once whispered lullabies to calm storms inside a child would now learn how to speak again, not with lullabies, but with lightning. Downstairs, Vanessa's laughter rang out again. Margaret smiled faintly in the dark. Not the end. Not even close. The room hadn't been touched in over a decade. Margaret stood in the narrow hallway leading to the old storage room tucked behind the kitchen, her fingertips grazing the chipped white doorframe. Dust blanketed the doorknob like a soft warning. This room used to hold Harold's work tools, gardening gear, a few half-finished projects that had outlived their urgency. After his death, she'd locked the door and left it that way, as if avoiding the dust could delay the grief. But now, with silence stretching like skin too tightly pulled, she needed a project. Something to tether her mind, something to remind her that she still occupied space in this house, not just time. She turned the knob. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a world frozen in memory. The air smelled of old wood and rusted hinges. Cobwebs clung to the corners like silent sentinels, and light from the hallway spilled across stacked boxes, paint cans, and a leaning wooden ladder. She coughed once, then stepped inside. Margaret didn't move quickly. Her body wouldn't let her, but she moved with purpose. She began sorting through the room, discarding empty containers, folding up drop cloths, sweeping piles of dead leaves that had blown in from the cracked basement vent. Her goal was modest: clear a corner, bring in a chair, and build herself a reading nook. A quiet place that belonged to no one else, not Andrew, not Vanessa. Just her. 2 hours passed. The dust settled. The room, once chaotic, had taken a softer shape. She'd claimed a corner near the small clouded window that overlooked the back garden. It was just big enough for a rocking chair and a narrow bookshelf. She'd already begun visualizing where her classics would go. Dickens, Eliot, Woolf, all the voices that never talked over her. She reached for the broom again, intending to sweep the last corner beneath a warped cabinet, when something odd caught her eye. A jagged line ran along the base of the far wall. Margaret crouched slowly, bones protesting with each inch. She brushed her hand against the surface, eyes narrowing. The drywall here was uneven, bulging in places, recessed in others, and behind it something felt hollow. She knocked. Thunk! She knocked again. Clink! The sound was unmistakable. There was something behind the wall. Her pulse quickened, not in fear, but in curiosity, that rare thrill she hadn't felt in years. She fetched the flathead screwdriver from Harold's rusted toolbox and began prying at the edge of a loose board. The drywall peeled back with surprising ease, crumbling in dry chunks that hit the floor like soft stones. And there, nestled behind the wall like a secret buried in bone, was a small iron box. It was the kind of box built before modern safes, sturdy, blackened with age, and locked with a rusted latch. It had no label, no markings, but Margaret recognized it instantly. Harold's box. The same one he'd kept beneath their bed for years, until one day it had simply disappeared. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached forward, hands steady now, and lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it to the workbench, set it down gently, and stared. The lock was intact, but beside it, taped to the front with aged yellowed adhesive, was a tiny brass key. Margaret's fingers hovered over it. She could hear her own heart pounding steadier than she'd felt it in weeks. She peeled the tape away. The key slid into the lock like it belonged there. With a slight turn and a sharp click, the lid creaked open. Inside, she found envelopes, folders, a leather-bound document portfolio. Everything was pristine, preserved with meticulous care. She reached for the topmost item, a sealed envelope with her name written in Harold's handwriting. Margaret, for when you need to remember who you are. Her throat tightened. She opened it. The letter inside was dated 9 years ago, 3 months before Harold's cancer diagnosis. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then I've failed to protect you in the one way that matters most, not from death, but from the silence that follows it. You always said I was the one who made the hard decisions, but you've always been the anchor of this family. You kept it together. You carried Andrew through storms I wouldn't have known how to weather. This house, our assets, the company shares, they're yours. Always have been. I set up a secondary will, one that Vanessa and Andrew aren't aware of. I saw how she looked at our home, at you. I knew she'd try to make you small someday. You are not small, Margaret. You are the strongest woman I've ever known. Use the documents wisely. Take what's yours when the time comes. And never ever let anyone make you feel like a guest in your own life. I love you always, Harold. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. The room spun slowly around her, past and present colliding in a quiet seismic shift. She wasn't just a widow, wasn't just a mother, wasn't just a shadow haunting the halls of a house she no longer recognized. She was the owner. The next folder held a series of notarized documents Harold's secret will witnessed and sealed. In it, he had transferred full ownership of the Hale family estate, their joint accounts, and most notably his controlling shares in North Atlantic Freight and Logistics, a multi-regional supply chain firm that had grown exponentially in the last 5 years. Margaret's hands shook as she flipped through the numbers. The shares alone were worth millions. She wasn't just surviving on Social Security and Harold's pension. She was by legal definition a majority stakeholder in a major logistics corporation. She was powerful. Tears welled in her eyes again, but these were not born of sadness. They came from something sharper. Revelation. For years she had been made to feel like excess, a relic. Background noise to Vanessa's performance of status and control. Even Andrew, her own son, had begun to look through her like she was glass, transparent, harmless, invisible. But this box, this truth, was anything but invisible. It was ammunition. It was armor. It was hers. Margaret closed the lid, locked it again, and held the key in her hand like a flame. She didn't feel old anymore. Not in that moment. She felt alive, like something inside her had been dug up with the wall. Something sacred. She looked around the room once more. Her reading corner could wait. Now she had something better. A reason. She took the box upstairs, wiped the dust from its surface, and placed it gently at the center of her dresser. As she did, she caught a glimpse of her reflection. Her face, lined by time and grief, didn't look tired anymore. The sorrow that had cloaked her since Harold's funeral was gone. In its place, there was something new, or rather old but long buried. Resolve, clarity, control. The silence that had defined her days no longer felt like oppression. It felt like strategy. She would not confront Vanessa tonight. Not tomorrow either. No Margaret Hale had spent years being dismissed, overlooked, patronized. She could afford a few more days. The box in the wall had done more than reveal a legal truth. It had reawakened the woman who built a family, a home, a life. And for the first time in years, Margaret was no longer afraid to make noise. Monday morning came with the silence of a loaded chamber. Margaret, dressed in charcoal gray slacks and a neatly pressed blouse, the same one she'd worn to Harold's memorial. Not out of mourning now, but as a form of quiet homage. She pinned her hair in a clean bun, slipped the old leather document portfolio into her handbag, and walked out the front door before Andrew or Vanessa stirred. The morning air was sharp and brisk, smelling faintly of chimney smoke and winter grass. She moved slower these days, but every step she took toward the town square felt strangely lighter. Not because she was forgetting anything, but because she was finally walking toward something again. The law office of Charles Avery sat between a shuttered bookstore and an insurance firm with a faded awning. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered, bringing with her the scent of cold air and leather. A young receptionist with red lipstick and overzealous eyebrows looked up. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" "No," Margaret replied, voice calm. "But Mr. Avery will want to see me. Tell him it's Margaret Hale." The woman opened her mouth to ask a question, but then caught the name Hale and simply nodded. "One moment, Mrs. Hale." 2 minutes later, Charles Avery emerged from his office. He hadn't changed much since Harold's time. Same tailored suits, same clipped beard, same cool efficiency. But when he saw Margaret standing there, portfolio in hand, something shifted in his eyes. "Margaret," he said, shaking her hand. "It's been a while." She nodded. 9 years. He held the door open. "Let's catch up." Inside the office was a cathedral of order bookshelves lined with legal volumes, a wall-mounted certificate from Harvard Law, the faint scent of cedar from a candle burning discreetly in the corner. They sat across from each other, and for a moment the silence hung with mutual respect. "I found something," Margaret said, placing the portfolio on his desk. "Harold left me a second will. It was hidden behind a false wall in our storage room." Charles raised an eyebrow. "He told me he might do that years ago, said there were dynamics in the family he didn't entirely trust." Margaret offered a tight smile. He was right not to. Charles flipped through the documents with precise movements. He checked the seals, scanned signatures, and held the last page up to the light. "It's real," he confirmed. "Witnessed, notarized, and completely enforceable." He looked up. "Do you want to challenge the public will?" "No," Margaret said softly but firmly. "I want to execute the private one, quietly." Charles leaned back. "That means transferring controlling ownership of the estate the Hale shares in North Atlantic Logistics and full financial authority into your name alone." "I know," she replied. "And you don't want your son or his wife to know?" "Not yet." He studied her. "Why?" "Because they've grown too comfortable in a house they don't own, spending money they think is theirs and talking to me like I'm a doormat with a pulse." Charles didn't flinch. He'd worked with the Hales long enough to know when steel lay beneath soft words. He nodded. "Then we'll do it my way. Quietly. Strategically." Over the next 2 hours, they went line by line through everything. Asset registries, beneficiary accounts, private holdings. Harold's voting power on the logistics board. Harold hadn't just prepared for this, he had planned it meticulously. Charles arranged for immediate internal transfers of the trust accounts to Margaret's sole management. The family estate was re-registered under her name. The funding channels previously allocated to Vanessa's business ventures were flagged for review. "Do you wish to suspend any disbursements from the Hale Trust to external entities?" Charles asked. Margaret stared out the window a moment, the gray light filtering through her reflection. "Yes," she said. effective immediately. Halt all monthly transfers to Vanessa Hale, her LLC, and any shell accounts linked to Luminous Bloom Holdings. That may rattle her, he said. Margaret turned back to him, eyes unblinking. Let her rattle. By the time she left Charles's office, the weight of the leather folder had transferred no longer just paperwork, but power. And for the first time in years, Margaret wasn't afraid to hold it. She walked 2 blocks farther downtown to the discreet, unmarked door of Finch & Associates, a small but elite private investigations firm that specialized in domestic intelligence fraud and what the founder once called truth with teeth. Olivia Finch had been a friend of Harold's, once well more of an acquaintance, but Harold had respected her enough to keep her card just in case. Margaret found it tucked inside the same box where the will had been stored. She stepped into the building, greeted by polished wood floors and silence. A woman in her 40s approached the desk, blazer, sharp hair in a sleek twist, eyes clear and clinical. Mrs. Hale, the woman said. I'm Olivia Finch. I believe we spoke briefly on the phone. Margaret nodded. Yes, thank you for seeing me so quickly. Of course. Olivia gestured to a side room. Come in. Tell me what you need. They sat 2 women separated by decades but connected by something more powerful precision. I want to know everything, Margaret said, about my daughter-in-law. Olivia didn't blink. Define everything. Previous marriages, legal entanglements, financial dealings, real estate affiliations, suspected affairs. Every past mistake that might repeat itself. Olivia's gaze narrowed slightly. You're not asking for suspicion. You're asking for confirmation. Yes, Olivia nodded. And why now? Margaret leaned forward. Because for 5 years I've been told to eat in silence, and now I want to know who exactly I've been feeding. Olivia cracked the faintest smile. You came to the right place. She slid a tablet across the desk. I'll need her full legal name, date of birth, social security number if you have it, or anything else that helps the search. Margaret handed over a manila envelope with everything she'd ever known about Vanessa Driver's license. Copies, tax forms, business cards, even an old boarding pass she'd plucked from the trash last fall. Olivia browsed the contents and whistled softly. You're thorough. I've been invisible long enough to notice things other people miss. Olivia looked impressed. Give me 3 days. Margaret rose. You've got 2. They shook hands. Back home, she returned to the kitchen with a calm so unsettling it almost felt like apathy. The tea kettle whistled softly. She poured a cup, added honey, and sat by the window, watching the bare trees sway outside like old secrets dancing in the wind. Vanessa breezed in 15 minutes later in heels and too much perfume. Margaret, she said without looking, tossing her coat on the banister. We're having dinner with some investors tomorrow. Could you make yourself scarce around 6? Margaret stirred her tea. Of course. Thanks, Vanessa added, already halfway up the stairs. You're such a help. Margaret sipped her tea. It tasted like victory in its infancy. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to fight back with words. She had something better now, a strategy, a secret, a timeline. And for the first time in years, she had the upper hand. Let Vanessa talk. Let Andrew stay blind. The game had started, and Margaret wasn't playing defense anymore. The first sign came on a Thursday morning, wrapped in a frown and a chipped manicure. Vanessa stood at the kitchen counter, clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles whitened around its edges. Her polished fingernails, usually flawless, were cracking along the edges like the confidence she wore daily. She paced in a controlled circle, silk pajama pants brushing against marble floors, her voice clipped and sharp. What do you mean he pulled out? She hissed into the speaker. That's impossible. We were supposed to close this week. Margaret sat at the breakfast table, quietly buttering her toast. The ticking of the wall clock behind her filled the spaces between Vanessa's frantic footfalls. No, Vanessa continued. He didn't mention any doubts before. The valuation was solid, the projections clean. This is outrageous. He's not answering my emails either. Why the radio silence? Margaret took a sip of tea, watching the steam curl upward like smoke from a smoldering fuse. Vanessa's heels clicked to a stop. Well, then find someone who can get me a straight answer, Jason. I need to know where this hesitation came from. Click. The call ended with the hollow finality of a dropped gavel. Vanessa stiffened slightly upon seeing Margaret still seated at the table, quietly folding her napkin into a square. Didn't see you there, she muttered. Margaret offered her a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm always here, dear. I'm just not always seen. Vanessa gave a tight, practiced laugh and poured herself a half glass of grapefruit juice. Well, you know what they say, business is war and war favors the bold. Margaret's voice was like satin over steel, and the honest. Vanessa's eyes narrowed for a heartbeat. Are you implying something? Of course not, Margaret replied smoothly. But I do know that things built on shaky ground tend to fall harder. She stood slowly, carried her plate to the sink, and rinsed it with a casual ease that felt oddly out of place. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to win favor or tread softly. She moved like someone who knew something, and Vanessa sensed it even if she couldn't name it yet. That afternoon, Andrew came home early from work, slinging his coat over the chair and loosening his tie as he walked into the kitchen. Everything okay? He asked his wife as she stirred coffee, lips pursed. No, she snapped. The Walker Group just pulled out of our expansion deal. No explanation, no warning. Andrew blinked. Wait, Walker, I thought they were already signed. Apparently not. Vanessa tossed a file onto the counter. They just stopped answering, canceled all meetings. Something changed. Margaret moved past them to refill the kettle. She didn't interrupt, didn't advise, didn't offer suggestions, and Andrew noticed. He glanced at his mother, almost startled by her composed silence. She usually has a theory, he said to Vanessa with a tired chuckle. Vanessa looked up sharply. Well, she's not exactly plugged into modern investment cycles, Andrew. Let's not start crowdsourcing from the AARP. Margaret stirred her tea. You're right, she said. I'm sure there are things far beyond me now. Still, some lessons like integrity tend to age well. Andrew's brow furrowed. Vanessa didn't respond. The cracks had begun, and Margaret could feel them. The next morning, Margaret's phone buzzed at 8:00 a.m. sharp. A simple message from Olivia, need to meet. You're going to want this in person. 9:30, my office. Oh, Margaret left without a word. She arrived at Finch & Associates 30 minutes later, greeted by the smell of fresh espresso and the low hum of a laser printer working in the background. Olivia was already seated at the conference table, a thick beige folder resting before her like a loaded trap. Margaret sat. Olivia pushed the file toward her. I'll talk you through it, she said. But you'll want to read every word. The first few pages were marriage records. Vanessa Ellen Brower. Previously Vanessa E. Rothschild. Vanessa E. Grant. 2 prior marriages, both to wealthy men, both of whom had widowed mothers. Margaret said nothing. Her silence was no longer passive, it was judicial. Olivia continued. First marriage, age 28, to a man named Charles Grant, founder of a small tech security firm. His mother, Lucille Grant, lived in the guest house on the family estate. A black and white photo accompanied the report, a frail woman in a wheelchair beside a koi pond. Within 6 months, Vanessa had full power of attorney over Lucille's affairs. Lucille was placed in a senior care facility. Official story was dementia. But she wasn't diagnosed, Margaret asked. Not formally. Lucille died there 14 months later. No living family remained. The estate passed to her son and eventually Vanessa. Margaret turned the page. Second marriage, age 33, to Howard Rothschild, son of a real estate magnate. The mother, Eleanor Rothschild, was a known philanthropist, healthy, active, a donor to women's colleges. After the wedding, she suffered a sudden fall down the stairs, broke her hip. Vanessa insisted she come live with them for support. Margaret's hands gripped the folder tighter. Within a year, Eleanor had no remaining visitors. Vanessa managed the mail, the calls, the social calendar. No allegations were ever formally filed, but neighbors told our team Eleanor seemed withdrawn, isolated, less herself. Let me guess, Margaret said coldly. She died too. Olivia nodded. Heart attack, alone. Margaret looked out the window. She's running the same playbook here. She's not just running it, Olivia said. She's refining it. Margaret closed the folder. The weight of it wasn't just informational, it was historical, generational. She was staring at a woman who targeted bloodlines, used charm as a mask, and left mothers buried behind gilded doors. And now Olivia added, "You're the next chapter." No, Margaret whispered. "I'm the epilogue." She stood, straightened her coat, looked Olivia in the eye. "You did well." Olivia gave a half smile. "You're not the first to hire me, but you might be the last." She's gotten careless. Outside, the sky was overcast, and Margaret walked slowly, holding the folder like it might detonate if jostled. Her mind played back every interaction, every harmless request, every backhanded compliment, every glass of wine Vanessa poured with a smile and a twist of something bitter underneath. It wasn't Margaret's imagination. It never had been. She'd been targeted, groomed for dismissal, slowly discredited in her own home until even Andrew couldn't hear her voice without flinching. Now she knew why. By the time she returned to the house, Vanessa had resumed her usual rhythm, draped across the living room chaise, with her laptop open and earbuds in. She barely glanced up. Margaret moved through the foyer like a ghost with weight. She stopped beside the old upright piano and stared at the framed photo of Andrew as a child 5 years old, holding a sand bucket at the beach, the sun painting gold through his hair. He had once believed she could fix anything, but the woman she'd become, the woman who folded napkins and apologized for existing, wasn't someone Andrew could recognize anymore. That was about to change. Vanessa's voice interrupted the moment. "Margaret, do you mind picking up some wine later? We've got a guest coming for dinner, some potential from Angel Bay Ventures." Margaret turned slowly. She looked at the woman she now understood in full. The smile, the lipstick, the flattering clothes, the way she inserted herself into the center of every conversation like a well-lit chandelier. And Margaret smiled back. "I'll see what I can do." Then she went upstairs, shut her bedroom door, and locked it behind her. She laid the folder on her desk, smoothed the papers with gentle fingers, and lit the lamp beside her. She had 2 days to prepare, because the mask was cracking, and when it finally fell, Margaret would be ready to show the world what it had been hiding all along. There was a certain chill in the house now, unspoken, but ever present. Margaret moved through it like a shadow with purpose, silent, invisible by design, but always watching. She no longer sought approval, no longer tried to bridge the gap. Something in her had shifted, calcified. She wasn't seeking reconciliation. She was collecting ammunition. That week, Olivia Finch sent her the second envelope. It was thinner than the last, but heavier somehow. Margaret took it from the courier's hand with a polite nod and retreated to her bedroom. She locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat down at her desk, the same one where Harold used to read market reports aloud, just to hear her opinion, even when he'd already made up his mind. She opened the envelope. Inside were photographs, Vanessa, and a man. Same hotel, same routine, different nights. A rhythm of betrayal dressed in luxury linen and room service. The man was identified as Robert Till's co-founder of Till's Mariner Ventures, a boutique investment firm in the city. Vanessa had mentioned him before casually, like he was just another name in her contact list. But these pictures told a different story. Each photo was stamped with dates and times, Tuesdays and Thursdays, always between 2:00 and 5:00 p.m., always Suite 427 at the Marriott downtown. There were also receipts. Room charges billed to Luminous Bloom Holdings, Vanessa's cosmetic company. Not under the guise of accommodation, but filed as consulting sessions. Each session billed at $1,500 for 3 hours. Margaret examined one invoice. Date November 7th, room 427, guest R. Till's billing account. Luminous Bloom, corporate. Another November 14th, same room, same guest, and again on the 21st. And the 28th. 4 weeks, 4 visits, same man, same hotel. Vanessa hadn't just been funding an affair. She had been doing it with Margaret's money funneled through a company propped up entirely by the Hale estate. A slow, measured breath escaped Margaret's lips. She should have been furious. Should have hurled the papers across the room, wept at the insult, cursed the betrayal. But all she felt was clarity. Vanessa's pattern wasn't careless. It was calculated. And now Margaret had proof of her professional fraud, her personal deceit, and her financial abuse. The battlefield was set. She organized the documents into labeled folders: affair evidence, misuse of company funds, unauthorized transactions, and placed them into a large charcoal gray binder. She tucked a flash drive into the inner sleeve, labeled in her neat handwriting contingency copy. Then she made a second binder, identical, She locked both in the bottom drawer of her desk and taped a small note to the back panel. "If anything happens to me, deliver to Charles Avery-esque." When she descended the staircase later that afternoon, the house felt different beneath her feet. Not like a home anymore, but like a stage. Vanessa was in the living room, reclined on the velvet chaise, scrolling through her tablet with one leg elegantly crossed over the other. She glanced up as Margaret passed and offered her usual sugar-coated smile. "You look nice," she said. "Going anywhere?" Margaret smiled. "Just stretching my legs. Nice weather today." Vanessa murmured, returning to her screen. "Don't forget we have guests coming for dinner Friday. I've invited the Sherwoods. They're friends of Robert's." Margaret paused. "Robert Tills." Vanessa's gaze lifted again, guarded now. "Yes, he's been very helpful with business strategy. We're hoping for a small infusion from his side firm." "I see." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose it's important to nurture valuable relationships." Vanessa blinked just once, as if trying to measure the undertone of the sentence. Margaret gave her no clues. She turned and continued toward the back porch, settling into Harold's old rocking chair with a book she had no intention of reading. Inside, Vanessa's voice floated up from her phone. "Robert Hay?" "Yes. Friday's still on. Margaret won't be a problem." Margaret smiled to herself and rocked gently, the sound of old wood creaking in time with a storm that hadn't yet begun. Later that night, she found Andrew alone in the kitchen, warming leftover lasagna in the microwave. His tie was loosened, his shoulders slouched. He looked like a man shouldering more than he could name. He smiled when he saw her. "Couldn't sleep," he said sheepishly. "You know how it is." She nodded, opening the fridge to pour herself a glass of water. "Yeah, Vanessa's stressed about some investor stuff. I don't even understand half of it anymore." "You used to," Margaret said gently. Andrew looked at her confused. "What do you mean?" "You used to be involved. Used to know every detail. Now it seems like she's the only one steering the ship." He leaned against the counter, frowning. "She says it's better that way. Less confusion, more consistent messaging." Margaret took a sip of her water. "You trust her?" The question was soft, without accusation. Andrew hesitated. "Yeah," he said. I think so." Margaret didn't press further. She simply nodded, kissed his cheek, and returned to her room. But the silence she left behind was heavy, and Andrew felt it long after the microwave beeped. By Thursday morning, Olivia sent a follow-up cross-referenced bank statements showing that Vanessa had also created a private account in the Cayman Islands, transferring large chunks from her business under the category Marketing and Outreach. The amounts matched the exact total of the Marriott stays. Margaret printed them all. Then she called Charles Avery. "I'm preparing a formal file," she said. "When the time comes, I'll need you ready with both legal and corporate oversight. This won't just be personal, it'll be public." Charles's voice was calm. "You're ready for that." Margaret looked at the binder resting beneath her palm. "I've been ready since the moment I stopped being afraid." He was silent a beat. "Then I'll prepare the documents." That evening, Vanessa sauntered into the kitchen in a crimson silk robe and poured herself a glass of red wine. "Just so you're aware," she said casually, "tomorrow's dinner is formal. Please don't wear anything floral." Margaret stirred her soup unbothered. "I was thinking navy. Conservative, respectable." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Interesting choice." Margaret met her gaze. "I've always liked navy. It hides blood well." The words were quiet. Not loud enough to alarm, but sharp enough to land. Vanessa stared at her. Margaret returned to her stirring. And that was when Vanessa began to realize the mask was no longer her own. And Margaret wasn't behind hers anymore. She was standing in full view, and she was waiting. It had been years since the Hale estate was lit like this. Every light inside the mansion blazed to life. Candles flickered in crystal holders along the staircase. Golden tablecloths draped the dining hall, trimmed with fresh lilies and etched place cards. Outside, in the winter air, valet drivers lined the circular drive, parking sleek sedans and matte black SUVs with investor plates. Champagne glasses clinked beneath string lights woven through the balcony rails. Vanessa had spared no expense. This dinner wasn't just a networking event. It was a performance, a final act of confidence after months of financial uncertainty. Her lipstick was bold, her heels higher than usual, and her smile so calculated it could cut glass. Tonight she would close the deal, secure funding, reclaim power. Andrew hovered behind her like a shadow in a charcoal suit, half ignoring conversations, half watching his wife glide through the guests with the fluency of someone who believed charm could erase history. Vanessa paused near the grand piano, chatting effortlessly with Robert Tills, the man she thought no one really noticed. He leaned in close, too close, with that smirk that said promises were being made out of earshot. "Everything in place?" he asked under his breath. Vanessa nodded. "They're all here. Sherwood Levine Torres. You, signed documents are in the car. Once they bite, I'll swing back and seal it." Vanessa took a long sip of champagne and scanned the room, eyes gleaming. And that's when the front doors opened. There was no announcement, no music shift, just a subtle ripple through the crowd like wind before a storm. Margaret Hale stood in the entrance wearing a deep navy pantsuit with clean lines and a silver brooch on her collar. Her white hair was swept into a French twist. She held no glass, wore no smile, only a thick leather binder in her right hand, and the kind of posture that silenced the room before a single word was spoken. She was not the cook, not the housekeeper, not the burden. She was the owner. The pause in conversation was microscopic but undeniable. Vanessa's hand stiffened around her flute. "Mother-in-law," she greeted, forcing a smile. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us." "I wasn't invited," Margaret replied calmly, her voice smooth as bourbon. "But I have business here same as you." Andrew, standing near the archway, looked between them with wide eyes. He opened his mouth to speak but said nothing. Margaret stepped further into the room. Following close behind her were 3 guests, no one recognized but who carried themselves with unmistakable authority. Charles Avery in a tailored gray suit carrying a briefcase. A woman in black slacks and a leather jacket, Olivia Finch, with a slim folder under her arm. And finally, a notary public named Peter Hensley, wearing his certification badge around his neck like a shield. Vanessa's face paled. Margaret scanned the room slowly, deliberately, acknowledging no one, until she reached the head of the table, the place Vanessa had clearly reserved for herself. Margaret placed the leather binder on the table with a single resounding thud. "Before you begin tonight's proceedings," she said, "I'd like to clarify a few legal matters." Vanessa laughed, though it came out brittle. "I'm sorry. Are we really doing this right now, Margaret? We have investors here." "Yes," Margaret said, "and they should know exactly what kind of business they're investing in." She nodded toward Charles. He opened his briefcase and handed out printed packets to every seated guest. Olivia followed, placing smaller folders in front of Robert and Vanessa. Peter remained beside Margaret, arms crossed, watching like a referee before the first punch. "What is this?" Robert asked, thumbing through pages. "Documentation," Margaret answered. "Of financial misconduct. Misappropriation of funds, a pattern of professional and personal deceit going back nearly a decade." "I don't know what you're talking about," Vanessa said, smile beginning to fracture. Charles stepped forward. "These documents include photographic evidence of unauthorized meetings between Ms. Hale and Mr. Tills at the Marriott Hotel over the past several months, billed directly to Luminous Bloom Holdings under falsified consulting expenses." Murmurs spread like fire across the room. One of the investors, Sherwood, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Vanessa, is this true?" Robert tried to interrupt. "We're leaving. This is ridiculous." "You can leave," Olivia said, pulling out a printed timeline of the transactions. "But you may want to explain why your name appears on a shell company receiving wire transfers from Vanessa's business every second Thursday." Another investor, Torres, stood. "Wait, what the hell is this?" Vanessa's face twisted, her perfect mask breaking open at the seams. "I don't know where this is coming from," she stammered. "None of this is what it looks like." Margaret took a single step forward. "It's exactly what it looks like. You've been siphoning money from a company you didn't build, funded by a trust you didn't earn, housed in an estate you do not own." Vanessa turned to Andrew. "Tell her to stop. This is sabotage. She's jealous." Andrew looked at her like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. I don't know what this is." Margaret placed a hand gently on her binder. "Let me explain." She turned to the room. "My late husband, Harold Hale, established a private trust years ago. That trust has funded Luminous Bloom from the beginning, quietly, anonymously, under my authorization. Every dollar Vanessa claimed came from strategic partnerships was my husband's legacy and mine to control." Silence. Utter damning silence. "I've since ceased all funding. Every account has been frozen, every document audited. The company will be reviewed for fraud. This estate, she turned to the guests, remains under my sole ownership. Vanessa Hale no longer has access to it, nor to any of its resources. Robert made for the door. No goodbyes, no defense. Torres and Levine followed behind, whispering. Sherwood hesitated, then turned to Andrew. I'd get ahead of this if I were you. They left. The room emptied. Only Margaret, Andrew, Vanessa, and Olivia remained. Vanessa's face was white. You think you can embarrass me like this? She seethed. You think you can destroy me? No, Margaret said. You destroyed yourself. I just turned on the light. Vanessa reached for Andrew's arm. Please, you know me. Tell her this isn't me. Andrew pulled away. He didn't speak. Margaret watched her daughter-in-law crumble, lips trembling, fury leaking out of every pore, but she felt no pleasure in it. Only finality. Vanessa stormed out of the house. No heels, no applause, no more illusions. The storm had passed, and Margaret Hale, who had been underestimated, dismissed, silenced, stood at the head of the table, calm and composed, not as a survivor, but as the one who set the fire and walked through it whole. The walls of the Hale estate had never heard silence like this, not even during Harold's wake. Not even on the night of his burial, when grief hung like fog in every room and Andrew wept quietly against the grandfather clock in the parlor. But tonight this silence was different. It was the stunned, airless silence that came when illusions shattered faster than breath. Only 4 people remained in the dining room now. Vanessa stood near the fireplace, arms folded tightly across her chest, as if she could contain the unraveling. Andrew lingered by the piano, silent, pale. Margaret stood tall at the head of the table, her fingers resting on the edge of the leather binder that had burned her daughter-in-law's kingdom to the ground. And beside her, Charles Avery adjusted his cuffs and nodded once. "Shall I proceed?" he asked. Margaret's eyes never left Vanessa. "Please." Charles stepped forward with practiced calm, opening a small leather portfolio as if reading scripture. As of this date, he began all financial transfers from the Hale Legacy Trust to the entity known as Luminous Bloom. Holdings have been lawfully and permanently terminated, effective immediately. Vanessa took a sharp step forward. "You don't have the authority." "I do," Margaret said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the room. "I am the sole living trustee and primary executor of the Hale estate. Harold amended the will in private, and his intent was clear. Everything this house, the business, shares the trust is mine." Vanessa's lips parted, then shut again. Her shoulders twitched with the weight of disbelief. "You're bluffing." Charles held up the sealed will, signed, notarized, with multiple witnesses. "This document has been verified and recorded. Any previous assumption of shared ownership is legally nullified under probate law. If you'd like to challenge it, I'll be happy to direct you to the appropriate court, though I'd advise against it." Olivia Finch, seated silently nearby, slid a manila folder across the table. Photographic documentation, bank statements, transaction histories, affidavits from the hotel staff. Your Thursday meetings with Mr. Tills weren't very subtle. Vanessa's knees bent slightly, like her body had just remembered the gravity of what it had lost. Her hand reached for the folder but stopped halfway, trembling. She looked at Andrew. "Tell them this is wrong. Tell them she's doing this out of spite." Andrew didn't move. Margaret studied him with careful eyes. He had always been her blind spot, her soft place. She had forgiven more than she should have over the years, blamed Vanessa for the walls between them. But now, she wasn't certain anymore where one ended and the other began. Vanessa's voice cracked. "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" He looked at her, jaw clenched. "No," Andrew whispered, "but I can't say I'm surprised." Something inside Vanessa snapped. "You're pathetic," she hissed. "You let her poison you. You let her turn you against me with some printed pages and a sob story." Margaret didn't flinch. "Truth doesn't need a sob story," she said. "It stands just fine on its own." Vanessa's face twisted, but her bravado was slipping with every passing second. Olivia added with deliberate clarity, "Several of your former investors have already reached out to my office. They've requested full audits. You'll be hearing from legal counsel in the coming days." Charles chimed in, calm but direct. "And because you used the trust's funds under false pretense, restitution will likely be pursued. You'll want your own attorney." "You think I don't have lawyers?" Vanessa snapped. "You don't have assets," Margaret replied. The room went still again. It was the most savage thing she'd ever said. Not in volume, not in profanity, but in truth. Because now that the house wasn't hers, now that the accounts had been frozen, the company crumbling, and her mask torn away, Vanessa was in every way that counted empty-handed. She turned toward Andrew again, tears now forming in her lower lashes, not theatrical ones, but panicked, real. The tears of someone who was drowning and only now realizing the tide wasn't turning. "Please," she said, "Andrew, we built a life." "You built a stage," he interrupted softly, "and I was just the prop." That was the last crack. Vanessa stumbled back, breathing fast, looking from face to face, but no one was rushing to rescue her. Margaret stood motionless. Charles began gathering papers. Olivia closed her folder. Finally, Margaret spoke. "You have 24 hours to vacate this home." Vanessa blinked. "What?" "I want you out. Tomorrow night, midnight. Whatever isn't packed will be boxed and sent, or donated." "You can't." "I can, and I will." Vanessa's face contorted. "You think I'll just walk out like some servant?" Margaret stepped forward. "No. I think you'll walk out like a woman who burned her own future and hoped no one would notice the smoke." Silence. Again. Only this time it was absolute. Vanessa didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. Not anymore. She turned on her heel and walked out of the room, back ramrod straight heels echoing down the marble hall. The click of the door upstairs her bedroom sounded final. Margaret turned to Andrew. He looked lost. Utterly and devastatingly lost. "She said she loved me," he said, barely audible. Margaret reached for the leather binder, closing it slowly. "Maybe she did," she replied. "But some people love in ways that look like control." He swallowed hard. "I should have protected you." "No," she said softly. "You should have remembered me." He nodded, and then he sat down, elbows on the table, head in his hands. The room around them still smelled like dinner, rosemary, wine, roasted vegetables. But the illusion of celebration had vanished. Margaret walked to the window, pushed it open, and let the cold night air sweep through the room. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt free, and for the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel like a ghost inside it. She felt like its rightful keeper. The next morning, Vanessa's world began to shrink. She awoke in the same guest bedroom she'd once mocked for being too colonial, surrounded by half-packed boxes and a suitcase that lay gaping on the bed like an open wound. Her phone lit up with unread messages, but none of them were from Robert. She scrolled, refreshed, called, straight to voicemail. She dialed again. "Robert, it's me. Call me back. We need to talk immediately." Click. Another call. Another voicemail. She texted him 3 times. "Where are you?" "They're coming after me. I need you to confirm the new funding. You said you were in this with me, Robert. Don't disappear now." Seen. No response. Vanessa sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding. It had all gone so wrong, so fast. The night before played on repeat behind her eyes. The documents, the humiliation, Andrew's stunned silence, Margaret's cold precision. She had never imagined the old woman capable of it. But what terrified her more was Robert's silence. Because Robert had promised her security. He'd said the fallback plan was bulletproof, that if things got messy, he had exit strategies, that they'd fly to Denver, start a new branch under his name, wash their hands of the whole thing. Now she realized Robert had been making promises the way she once did, for leverage, not for love. And he had likely cashed out and vanished the moment the funding froze. The man who'd once whispered, "You deserve better than them," was now as gone as the money. She clutched the phone tighter as if she could force it to ring, but the silence stretched on. Across the hall, Andrew sat alone in what used to be his father's study. He hadn't slept. Not really. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw slack. He stared at an old family photo, Margaret, Harold, and himself at age 10, posing in front of a Christmas tree. The child in the picture was grinning up at his mother like she was the sun. He had forgotten that. Forgotten what her smile looked like when it wasn't forced. Forgotten the strength in her voice when she used to sing along to the radio. Forgotten how she never missed a parent-teacher conference, or a Saturday soccer game, or a chance to sneak peanut butter cookies into his backpack. He'd watched that woman get reduced to a whisper in her own home, and said nothing. Because it was easier. Because Vanessa made sure it was easier. He rubbed his face, then pushed the photo aside, unable to look at it anymore. When he emerged into the hallway, Margaret was already at the dining table, pouring herself a modest cup of black coffee. Her movements were graceful, precise. There was no gloating in her posture, no triumph in her eyes. Just clarity. Andrew stood in the doorway, hands shoved into his pockets like a boy facing the principal. "Do you have a minute?" Margaret looked up, always. He sat across from her, eyes down. His voice came out hollow. "She's trying to call him. Robert." Over and over. "She won't get through," Margaret said evenly. "He's gone." Andrew flinched. "You knew." "I knew enough to know men like that don't stick around when the lies start costing money." A beat passed. Andrew's shoulders slumped. "I didn't know she was that person." Margaret didn't say anything. "I thought." He exhaled sharply. "I thought she was strong, ambitious, driven. I thought she saw something in me, believed in me." "She did," Margaret said. "She saw your blind loyalty, and she used it." He swallowed hard. "She said you never liked her." "I didn't like what she made you become." Andrew looked up, eyes red. "I'm sorry. It came out rough, broken. For all of it," he said. "For not seeing it. For letting her treat you like that. For not protecting you." Margaret leaned forward, her hands folding gently on the table. "I don't need protecting, Andrew. I never did." He nodded slowly. "I was weak." "No," she corrected. "You were lost." She let the words land before continuing. "But I want you to understand something very clearly." He met her gaze. "I don't save weak men," she said. "I offer second chances to those who fight for them." Andrew stared at her, stunned. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. He felt the weight of it, every syllable soaked in truth. He nodded once, slowly, gratefully. "I want to fight for it. I want to be better." Margaret gave him a long, quiet look. "Then start by facing what you let happen." He lowered his head, shame etched deep in the lines around his mouth. "I lied to myself," he whispered. "I told myself she was helping you adjust, that you were old-fashioned, that maybe I was doing the right thing by staying neutral, but I wasn't. I was cowardly, and I didn't want to see how much you were hurting." Margaret's voice softened. "People don't always need you to choose sides. Sometimes they just need to be seen." Andrew's eyes shimmered. "I see you now, Mom." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that heals rather than separates. From upstairs came the sound of drawers slamming. Vanessa was packing with the fury of someone trying to outrun the consequences. Andrew looked toward the ceiling, then back at his mother. "What do I do?" Margaret's reply was simple. "Let her go." He hesitated, then nodded. He rose from the table, walked out of the room and up the stairs slowly, deliberately. Margaret remained seated. She didn't follow. Didn't need to. She had done what needed to be done. Not for revenge, not for spectacle, but because someone had to end the performance. And Margaret Hale, once silent, once overlooked, had finally closed the curtain herself. The sound of a suitcase dragging across hardwood floors was the final punctuation to Vanessa Hale's performance. It was a gray, windless morning. No birds, no sunlight, just the low murmur of cold air pressing against the windows of the Hale estate. Vanessa moved through the foyer like someone stepping out of a dream-turned-nightmare, her heels clicking sharply, her lips pressed into a line so thin it barely held back fury or shame. Maybe both. Andrew stood by the door, not speaking, not touching, just watching as she gathered the last of her things into the back of a rideshare. She didn't look back, not once. When the car disappeared around the bend, silence followed. A deep, unapologetic kind of silence, the kind that didn't ask questions, didn't need apologies. It simply was. Margaret stood upstairs at the landing, arms crossed over her chest. She hadn't come down to say goodbye. That wasn't her role anymore. The door clicked shut. It was over. By the end of the week, the house felt different. Not lighter, at least not yet, but cleared. Like something heavy had been dragged out into the open and exorcised, leaving behind only air and space and the quiet hum of possibility. Margaret sat in Harold's old chair with a stack of papers on her lap and a cup of tea going lukewarm beside her. The documents were crisp new letters of incorporation bylaws, tax exemption filings. Across the top of the first page, an elegant serif typeface, the Hale Foundation for Financial Justice. She had debated what to call it. For a moment, she considered erasing the family name altogether, carving something new from the wreckage. But no, that name still meant something. Not because of legacy or status, but because of Harold. And because it was hers now. Not borrowed, not shared, not granted, owned. The Foundation's mission was simple: provide educational scholarships to young people from marginalized communities, and offer financial legal aid to senior citizens being exploited by family caretakers or business fraud. Margaret had seen the void with her own eyes, what it looked like when a person was dismissed as old rather than respected as wise. What it felt like to be invisible in the very house you built. She was going to fill that void, brick by brick, word by word, one line and one bank transfer at a time. She closed the folder and took a breath. Not a proud one, not a triumphant one, but a grounded one. A breath that belonged to someone who had lived through the fire and now had ash beneath her fingernails and a blueprint in her hands. That evening, Andrew returned from the guest room he'd temporarily moved into and stepped into his childhood bedroom. The posters were long gone. The desk was too small, but the room still smelled faintly of cedar and safety, of secrets whispered into pillows and flashlight stories under blanket forts. He set a small suitcase on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. His mother had cleared a space in the closet. He didn't deserve it, but it was there. For days he kept to himself, did his laundry, cooked simple meals, paid bills on time. He even started organizing the garage, a task he'd ignored for 5 years. Margaret let him. She gave him space, not out of distance but respect, because redemption wasn't something a person could be handed. It had to be lived in. One morning, as the kettle boiled and the sun sliced across the countertop in thin golden stripes, Andrew entered the kitchen and found Margaret chopping carrots with practiced grace. "Smells good," he said. She didn't look up. "Chicken stew." He stepped beside her, hesitated, then reached for the potatoes. "May I?" She glanced at him, her eyes curious, soft, but without indulgence. "Yes," she said. They cooked together in silence for the first few minutes, Margaret measuring spices by memory, Andrew peeling slowly, unsure if he was doing it right. "You're not pressing hard enough," she murmured. He adjusted. "Better." She nodded. As they moved in tandem, passing ladles, stirring pots, slicing herbs, something began to shift. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. By the time the stew was simmering on the stove, the kitchen smelled like home. Andrew reached for 2 bowls, set them on the table, poured water into matching glasses. Margaret ladled the stew with precision and handed him a full bowl. They sat across from one another, mother and son. No accusers, no witnesses, no lawyers or liars or weighty truths between them. Just warm broth, shared bread, and the long overdue feeling of something rebuilding. Andrew took a bite and exhaled. "God, I forgot what this tasted like," he murmured. Margaret didn't smile, but her shoulders relaxed just enough. He looked at her, quiet, earnest. "Did you ever think about leaving?" "Every day," she answered honestly. "But it wasn't my time." "What changed?" "I remembered who I was, and I stopped asking permission to be her again." He looked down at his bowl, then back up at her. "I want to remember too." She met his gaze. "Then stop trying to be the man she wanted and start being the man you forgot to fight for." They ate in silence again, but this time the silence wasn't a wedge. It was a bridge. That night, after dishes were washed and lights dimmed, Andrew paused at the hallway to his room. "Good night, Mom." Margaret looked up from her book. Her reply was soft. "Good night, Andrew." She didn't say sweetheart, not yet, but he heard it anyway. And in the house that had once been a battleground, 2 people sat under one roof, breathing the same air, beginning again not as strangers tethered by blood, but as 2 survivors of the same war, finally rebuilding the same home. The room smelled of ink and memory. Margaret sat at her old oak desk, the one Harold had bought her on their 10th anniversary. Its surface was worn smooth from decades of utility grocery lists, family Christmas cards, condolence letters, tax filings. All had passed through this space like seasons. But today there was only one thing before her, a thick, hardbound journal with blank ivory pages and a burgundy ribbon tucked between them. She dipped her pen in ink. Not a ballpoint, not a typewriter, not a glowing laptop screen. Ink, real, permanent, imperfect. The kind of tool you use when you want every word to matter. She began simply. "My name is Margaret Hale, and for 5 years I stopped existing in my own home." The pen moved slowly but deliberately. Her fingers stiffened occasionally, age or perhaps grief, but she pressed through it. There were no poetic metaphors, no overwritten revelations, just truth, clean, steady, honest. She wrote about the first time Vanessa made her feel like furniture, about the night she carried her dinner upstairs and cried into a plate she'd seasoned with rosemary and self-erasure. She wrote about Harold, about the trust he left behind, the faith he'd placed in her, the power she didn't know she had until someone tried to erase her name from the very will of the man who loved her most. She wrote about silence, how loud it could become when used as a weapon, how easy it was to confuse being polite with being unseen. And then she wrote about the shift, the wall, the hidden box, the truth in papers and keys, and the strange, exquisite relief of remembering you are not the one who is broken, they are. She wrote not just to remember, but to warn, to leave a breadcrumb trail for women who, like her, had once felt invisible. She ended the first entry with a question. If someone stole your voice, would you even notice? And beneath that, in smaller script, or would you simply grow quiet and call it maturity? The door creaked open behind her, and Andrew stepped in holding a travel bag and a suit jacket. "Are you sure you're okay with me leaving for the weekend?" he asked. Margaret looked up from the page, smiling gently. "Of course," she said. "You're not 17, you're not grounded." He smiled, but there was a flicker of nerves behind his eyes. "I don't know if I'm ready to talk about all of it, out loud." "You don't have to be perfect," she said. "Just be honest." He nodded, then walked toward her and gently placed a small envelope on the desk. "I printed the flyer. Thought you might want to see it." Margaret opened it. Restoring the Man Behind the Mask. A healing conference for men affected by emotional abuse. Below the title was Andrew's name, his credentials, his story summarized in one painful, hopeful sentence. "I spent 5 years loving someone who taught me how to lie to myself. And now I'm trying to learn how to tell the truth again." Margaret traced the letters with her thumb. "You'll do fine," she said. He leaned down, kissed the top of her head, and whispered, "Thanks, Mom." That word didn't sting anymore. It fit. In a different city, 3 states away, under a new name, Vanessa Brower adjusted her pearl earring in the restroom mirror of a tech accelerator lounge. Her hair was darker now, her voice a little higher. Her name, according to the building badge clipped to her blazer, was Elena Roth. She smoothed her blouse, pulled her shoulders back, and stepped into the glass-paneled conference room where a group of investors sat waiting. She passed out product samples with the grace of someone who had done this dozens of times, because she had. Different city, same pitch, affordable, organic, scalable, built by women for women. One of the older investors leaned forward, smiling at her charm. "Impressive. How long have you been in this space?" She tilted her head, eyes soft, voice sweet. "Oh, just long enough to know what it takes to build something beautiful from the ground up." She laughed. They laughed with her. Outside the building, a street banner flapped in the wind. "Downtown Denver welcomes Innovation Week." Elena didn't look up. She'd always known how to leave before the fire reached her ankles. Meanwhile, in a hotel ballroom decorated in navy and white, Andrew Hale stood behind a wooden podium. His tie was slightly askew, his hands gripping the sides just a little too tight, but his voice was strong. "There's a strange shame," he said, "that comes with being manipulated by someone you loved. Especially when the world sees you as the man, the protector, the logical one, the stable one. I spent years thinking I was those things." A pause. "I wasn't. I was compliant. I was silent. And I hurt people by thinking silence was the same as peace." There were maybe 40 men in the audience. Some had notebooks open. Some stared blankly, faces unreadable. A few sat with their arms crossed, but their eyes stayed locked on him. "My wife didn't just lie. She isolated. She strategized. She convinced me that my mother was a burden, that her voice was annoying, that her opinions were childish, and I let it happen." His voice wavered. "But my mother didn't fight back with anger. She fought back with the truth, with documentation, with quiet, deliberate power. And when the lie collapsed, she was still standing." He looked out over the crowd. "I'm still learning how to be a man who deserves that kind of forgiveness." Applause came slowly but genuinely. It wasn't thunderous, it wasn't cinematic, but it was real. That night, back at home, Margaret sat by the fireplace with her journal open beside her and a stack of scholarship applications in front of her. One letter caught her eye. It was from a girl named Rosalie, 17, applied for the Hale Foundation's Women in Finance Scholarship, raised by a grandmother after her mother disappeared. GPA 4.2, volunteer at the local shelter. At the bottom of the application beneath the formal closing, Rosalie had handwritten a note. "Thank you for starting this. My grandma said sometimes the world only listens when women write it down. I'm trying to write too." Margaret folded the page slowly, then smiled. She looked at the flames dancing low and steady. They didn't roar, but they burned clean, and she thought, maybe the most powerful stories don't start with fire. Maybe they start with a woman sitting alone remembering she doesn't have to whisper anymore. Then she picked up her pen and kept writing. The late afternoon light stretched long across the hardwood floor, drawing soft gold patterns that shimmered under Margaret's feet as she moved through the quiet house. There was no music playing, no clatter in the kitchen, no voices echoing from a phone on speaker, just the low hum of peace, earned peace. The dining room table was already set. 3 white plates, but only 2 would be used. 1 she'd leave empty. A habit, a ritual, a nod to the man who had once said, "This table will always be our anchor," and it was. Through decades of birthdays, arguments, turkey dinners, bills, bad jokes, burned roasts, first dates, and long silences, and now through rebirth. Margaret stood at her writing desk and unfolded a clean sheet of paper. No letterhead, no pretense, just truth and a pen. She wrote slowly, every word weighed, every sentence meant. There was no need for a draft. "Dear Harold," I found the box, and in it I found myself. She paused. Outside wind whispered against the window panes like the house was sighing in relief. "You were right to hide it, and I was right to wait." It didn't just hold documents or ownership or directives. It held the part of me I'd buried so deep beneath obligation and grief that I forgot how to dig it back up. But now I remember her. The woman you married. The woman who didn't apologize for taking up space. I spoke, I fought, and I stayed standing. She smiled at the memory of the night Vanessa had left heels striking marble dignity, dissolving with every step. "Our boy came back to me, Harold. In pieces at first, like a mirror that's been dropped one too many times. But he's trying. And I see parts of you in him now. Not the posture or the voice, but the integrity. The courage to say, 'I was wrong.' You would have been proud." She exhaled slowly and wrote the last words with care. "Thank you for building the foundation. I finally learned how to live on it. All my love, Margaret." She folded the letter gently and slid it into a small, hand-stitched envelope. Then she walked to the garden and tucked it under a smooth stone beside the rosemary bush Harold had planted their second spring in the house. Inside, the front door creaked open. "Mom." Margaret turned. Andrew stood in the hallway, tie-loosened sleeves rolled up. He looked older these days, not worn, not broken, but honest, like a man rebuilding from the ground up. She smiled. "Dinner's almost ready." He entered the kitchen, pulling out 2 wine glasses like it was muscle memory. "You want the red or the white?" "Let's be bold," she said. "The red." He poured. She stirred. They moved together quietly, smoothly, not like strangers figuring each other out, like people who had earned this rhythm. They sat at the table, the same one Vanessa had once banished her from, the same one where Harold used to read the newspaper upside down so Margaret would correct him and laugh, the same table where Andrew once finger-painted a mess so joyful that she refused to clean it for days. Margaret picked up her fork and took a bite of roasted vegetables. Across from her, Andrew paused. Then in a voice roughened by humility, he said, "I see you now, Mom." She looked up. And this time she didn't blink back the tears. She let them fall one by one, quiet and clean, because he meant it. And he hadn't before. There was no grand gesture, no epic forgiveness speech, no cathartic movie moment embrace. Just 2 people sitting at the same table, both finally visible. After they cleared the dishes, Margaret returned to her desk one last time. She opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the iron key, the one that had once opened a hidden box behind a wall no one remembered. She held it in her palm, so small, so unassuming. It had changed everything. She turned to Andrew. "Do you want to keep it?" He tilted his head. "The key?" "No," she said. "What it unlocks." He hesitated, then reached out and took it. "Not to hold," she added, "just to remember." He nodded. "I won't forget again." And in the fading twilight, with nothing more than a chair, a table, and a shared silence, Margaret Hale, mother-widow, survivor, sat back in her chair and felt something deeper than victory. Wholeness. She hadn't just found a will. She hadn't just reclaimed an estate. She had opened something far more sacred, Her own voice, her own power, her own place at the table. And as she watched her son rinse the final dish and dry it with care, she whispered so softly even the walls had to lean in to hear. I was never locked away. I just needed to remember where I left the key.